So Nader Dabit, all the way from where?
America.
Nader, where are you coming from? Mississippi, United States, all the way.
Wait first.
How far was this journey?
Wait first.
No,
Wait.
no.
No. Come.
How far was the journey?
Wait first.
About a day and a half.
Just for this talk. Just for this talk.
Wait. You guys are so gassed. Wait. What is Mississippi popular for? Huh? Please, Nada, can you tell us what Mississippi is popular for?
Oh, Mississippi's popular for, we have really, really great food. So,
Which food? Which food?
You never chop jollof rice.
It's
Which
not as good.
food?
It's not as good as the food I've had here.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much for that intro. Yeah, I've been wanting to come here for like 5 years now. I've met so many people from this community. I've met so many people from this community over the last, my entire career, over the years. Every week, every month, I'm meeting someone new. And then I feel like my entire career has kind of led up to this trip here. And now I'm like seeing literally dozens or even hundreds of people that I know from online and seeing them in real life. I just want to say it's like a really big honor for me to be here speaking at this event. Back in 2020 or 2019, whenever this last event was, I was talking to Samson and I wanted to come out here, but I couldn't make it. So when this event was announced, I knew I had to be here and I decided to make the trip. I told Samson I was coming and now I'm here. So this is an open source conference, and over the last year, I've been diving into blockchain, and I've been getting into what we're calling now Web3. But what I want to talk about today is a completely new talk that I put together for this event that hopefully will resonate with the whole vibe and the whole topic of what we're here to talk about, which is open source. And I want to talk about what Web3 means for open source. And to kind of get started, I want to first, let's see if this thing is working here. I don't know if this is working. I don't think. You want to maybe check this out? Yeah. Oh, it is. Oh, okay, got it. There we go. Okay, cool. So my name is Nader, and as they mentioned when they introduced me, I'm a developer. I'm an author, an OSS open source contributor. I'm currently working in developer relations for the last 4 years, and I've considered myself a teacher for the last 7 or 8 years. I've done everything from developer relations, giving workshops, all the way to opening one of the first coding schools and putting on the first meetups in Mississippi. I think we have some technical difficulties. We'll be right back. You can tell what I'm about to say is important because, someone's trying to shut us down right now. There we go. It looks like we're getting back started. Just 1 second. So is everybody enjoying the event so far? Can we give like a big hand for all of the organizers because they've done a really, really, really good job. I think I talked to someone and they said they've been working on this for 6 months. So it definitely is showing. It's been really great. So All right. Okay, cool. So before I talk about what Web3 means for open source, I want to first kind of talk about what I think Web3 is. And you might have heard people talking about Web3 a lot over the past year, and you've probably heard a million different definitions. And I don't think like there is a single definition. I think I just wanted to talk about how I interpret what Web3 is. I've been working in Web3 now, like I mentioned, for 1 year. We've seen massive growth over the last year. We've seen massive adoption over the last year. Every company that has a large name in the United States that I've worked with is talking about some blockchain or Web3 strategy. I've heard the same thing from companies around the world. So let's talk about like why this is happening and why it's happening right now. So if I had to give a definition of what Web3 is, to me, I would just say it's the stack of protocols that enable fully decentralized applications. Now, that is a term that might differ from what a lot of the stuff that we've heard in the typical like conversation. So let's break that down a little bit. What does that actually mean? Well, when we think of the web as it is today, it's it's been very, very useful. And we have a lot of different things that we can do because of all of the innovation that's happened over the course of the last few dozen years. And the reason that I think that we've kind of been able to do all these things is because of existing web protocols that we use every day. If you're a developer, whether or not you know it, you've used most of these protocols, FTP, SSH, TCP, etc. If I build a website using HTTP, I know that anyone in the world can access my website without a centralized intermediary. We can expect that it's just going to work. And because of these protocols that we've used every day, people from around the world are able to build applications and collaborate together. But there are a couple of major pieces of functionality that were not part of the existing protocols that we had up until the last few years. Because essentially what these protocols allow us to do is attach text files to addresses and make them accessible from the internet. We were unable to do things like program into the internet native state, native payments, and native compute. So what have we done to kind of get around that? Well, we've essentially built out very, very complex centralized applications and centralized infrastructure to manage that. When we think of actual state and we think of compute, we typically think of today something like a cloud provider where we have a database or we have a server that's running somewhere, but if that server goes down, our application goes down. When we think about, digital payments, the infrastructure that's needed for me in the United States to send a payment to someone that lives in Palestine is extremely, extremely complex. If I want to send payments to them, I have to open a bank account, I have to get an ID, I have to get money, all of these things have to work together. I need to then deposit that money in the bank. I have to open an email address, I have to sign up for some account online, I have to attach all that stuff together, and then the person on the other side of the world has to do all of these things. All of the code that actually is necessary to make that run is absolutely obscene. So when we think about breakthrough technologies, we typically talk about this idea of a 10x improvement. When we think about revolutionary things that happen, typically they are a step function improvement over what we had in the past. So with blockchain technology and the introduction of digital scarcity, that is a step function improvement around us being able to send digital payments, or in our actual use cases, this idea of digital scarcity, because anyone in the world to receive money or some type of tokens, all they need to do is have a web browser, download an extension, and they can pass that address to someone and they can receive payments. There are no gatekeepers, there's no intermediaries that are stopping that from happening. So with smart contract technology, we now have this idea of being able to build in native payments, native state, and native compute. So with all those things being said, to me, the definition of Web3 is the combination of all of the things that we had in the past, all of the great technologies that we've been using forever, and we now also have this addition of native payments, native state, and native compute. So when we think of Web3, we don't think of it as a replacement, we think of it as an enhancement. So with all of this new technology stack, when we're now being able to kind of work with these new primitives or these new protocols, what does that actually enable? And I think this is the discussion that we typically see around Web3. The characteristics of Web3 are what we typically see when we have these conversations. So what are some of the characteristics of enabled by Web3? The main one that you'll hear talked about a lot, and the most important one, is decentralization. And this isn't only the decentralization of things like the actual infrastructure that our applications are running on, we're also decentralizing ownership of platforms and data and companies. So instead of having a single, I would say like CEO that has like a large portion of ownership or a small number of people, you typically see Web3 applications and protocols built where the ownership is more equally shared for all of the network participants. You have the introduction of digital scarcity, which is kind of like where tokens come into play when we think of cryptocurrencies and NFTs. You have this idea of displacing intermediaries. We have DeFi protocols that run $1 billion worth of transactions through them with a team of less than 10 developers that in the past would have needed thousands of people to be sitting in their banks, paying rent, running air conditioning. Huge overheads are completely wiped out by smart contract technology. We also have this idea of distributed and robust infrastructure. If my application is running on AWS and US East 1, and US East 1 goes down, the entire internet almost goes down because so many people are kind of relying on that single point of failure. In a decentralized protocol, your application is running across hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of servers. 99% of the network can go down and your application is still running. That is extremely powerful. That's an extremely powerful idea that not a lot of people understand about Web3. Self-sovereign identity. We just saw Okta with that new data breach. Every day we see data breaches. We see dozens or hundreds of data breaches every year that make the news. And we're not even hearing about all of the data breaches because everyone is so used to storing personal information, tying it to all of this very sensitive data, and not having the best security practices around it. So I think one of the really, really great ideas around Web3 is rethinking how we deal with identity in the first place. So self-sovereign identity kind of like falls into that category. Because all these applications are built on public distributed ledger technologies, then all of these backends are actually completely open and public for anyone to use. I'm gonna dive into that in a little bit to kind of describe why that's important. And with this idea of open composable backends, we have this data that's free to consume by anyone in the world. It's open and public by nature. It's trustless, meaning that anyone can interact with my backend that is completely available for anyone to build upon, adding to that idea of composability. And we have immutability. And I'm going to talk about this right-hand section for the most of this talk because I think that's some of the most powerful and important stuff about Web3. So when we hear about Web3, we often hear people having these very polarized conversations. People will say, Web3 is going to save the world and it's the best thing to ever exist. And then you'll see people that will tell you that Web3 is going to be the worst thing that's ever happened to the world. And in reality, we've never talked about any technology like that. Like, why is this different? Why are people so divided in these conversations around technology? I think most of the time they're just uneducated about how all this stuff works. Just like any technology, it has trade-offs. Some are good trade-offs, some are bad trade-offs. And I think, so it's by nature not good or bad, just like by nature the internet, when it was introduced, allowed people to blackmail you. They allowed people to harass you. They allowed people to do a lot of really terrible things. But we still use the internet today, right? Because by looking at all of the entire picture, overall we see it as like a net improvement. And that's the way I see Web3. So with that being said, how does Web3 and OSS combine, and what am I going to be talking about here to kind of focus around open source? And to kind of get into that, I first want to just give a brief overview of my own personal journey into open source. So I started coding in 2012. I created my first GitHub commit in 2014. I then open sourced my first project in 2016, two years later, called React Native Elements. React Native Elements has been used hundreds of thousands of times, or millions of downloads, I guess you could say at this point. Amazon uses it and a lot of other big companies use it. But one of the things that I noticed about running React Native Elements as an open source project that was being used by all these billion-dollar companies is that we found it really fucking hard to pay the bills for anyone that was actually working on it. So even though we had a very, very successful project, we were literally bringing in less than $1 an hour for the work that was being put into it. And I just thought that wasn't fair. And I think that obviously a lot of the discussions around open source are around funding, and I think that's the number one most important thing that we should be talking about. How can we get money into the people's hands that are creating the value that is being exploited by these big corporations around the world? Anyway, so I then worked at AWS for over 3 years, where we maintained a lot of open source libraries, and we built upon a lot of other people's open source. And I also noticed at AWS, we were not giving money back to any of these people. We would maybe do like a little bit of pennies here and there just to kind of make people happy, just to say, oh, we contributed $10,000 to this project. But in reality, we were kind of taking advantage of all of these contributors from around the world, and I just don't think that's an ethical way to go about it. Right now, I work in the Graph protocol. The Graph protocol is something I'll talk about in a little more in depth later on. So with that being said, with my description of OSS funding models not working out for us, let's talk about the current standard of open source funding models. This is a very good diagram because it actually is 99% of what's happening today in almost all of the software that we use today. You have a million or billion-dollar company that's built an application, and they don't even know it, but they're depending on hundreds of little libraries that are being maintained by people that aren't making any money from that. And that's kind of the whole idea that we need to change. So how can we go about doing that? Well, to talk about that, let's talk about the current options that are available. If you want to build an open source project and get funding, 90% or more of like what you end up doing is essentially just begging for donations. You send out a tweet, you put some like information in your GitHub README, you're essentially groveling for like nickels and dimes from these billion-dollar companies that are using your project, and you're just asking them for donations, but that's not the way it should work. Of course, you could be something like a Vercel or something like that who have actually built out really, really great companies around their open source. But that's the exception, not the rule. If I have a great library that I want to release, that I don't want to spend the rest of my life like focusing on just to build and maintain an entire company just to pay the bills, then how can I actually make that happen? And that's kind of the focus of what we need to be thinking about. We want to enable people to be able to build open source and make money from it without having to kind of break their backs. So what are some Web3 funding models? So these are the old school funding models: GitHub donations, Open Collective, Patron, general just donations and stuff. Well, Web3 funding models are very interesting. The first one I want to talk about are grant programs. So if you are looking to get into Web3, we have over $10 billion that's been allocated between the protocols that I researched just in the last week, available for people to get paid to work on open source. $10 billion, that's a lot of money. And every day we hear about new allocations and new rounds that are given to these protocols. This is a few examples. Near Protocol, $800 million. Harmony One, $300 million. At the Graph, we've given away over $100 million in the past 12 months. All of these, Sandbox, over $1 billion. These are real numbers, and these grants are being picked up by people right now today to build open source. Polygon, Shadipo is here. He said over $200 million is available through Polygon. So to dive into that in a little more depth, at the Graph protocol where I worked, like where is this money going? Well, we gave the largest grant for open source that I would say towards the Guild. They received $48 million to work on GraphQL and Graph development. And the Graph protocol is, for the most part, open source. Our smart contracts and all of our Graph node, everything is in our GitHub. You can go check it out. We gave $100,000 for someone to build a GraphQL schema prototyper. That's going to be available for the entire world to use. It's not ours, as is all this other code. We have a private front-end design tool that will be released publicly once we're done with it that received $400,000. It's completely open source. The Graph Academy is an open source and free to use website for people that want to learn how to build Web3. All these different things. LimeChain received $248,000 to basically build testing for the Graph protocol, all open source. So this is some of the examples of some of the grants that are out there. And these are real numbers, and people are picking these up all the time. So how does this work, though? So where does this money come from? And I think that's where this idea of protocols come into play. And as a developer that's been building centralized software for a long time, I was blown away around the ideas of protocols once I understood how these tokenized protocols were actually working and the value that was bringing to the table and the value propositions behind them. Remember, when I talked about Web3, one of the main characteristics was abstracting away inefficient intermediaries. And that's what protocols do at a fundamental level. So one really great example of someone that's starting to try to leverage this, and I just want to talk about this example because it's something that came up this week. Max Howell created a project called Homebrew. Who here has heard of Homebrew? Who here uses Homebrew? Yeah, everybody uses Homebrew, right? I would say, like, if you're a software developer for more than a year or two, you've probably used Homebrew. So Max Howell is famous for creating Homebrew, but he's also famous for a couple of other things. One of the things that he talks about is how after creating Homebrew and it becoming wildly successful, one of the most successful open source projects in the history of software, he went to interview at Google where all of those engineers were using Homebrew, and he got denied a job at Google when he was probably the most qualified engineer that they probably had interviewed that week, that month, that year. So that's interesting. Another thing that he talks about is how he literally couldn't pay his bills, even though he created a piece of software that was being used all the time by billion-dollar companies. He didn't have enough money to raise a family, essentially, and he had to go and do something else. So that's not right. So what is he doing today? Well, this week he released something called T. And T is a Web3 package manager that he just launched. That's a really interesting use case around Web3. So what did he say about T? What is the elevator pitch? We're moving the package registry on chain. So let's dive into that a little more details to kind of see what that actually means, because that sounds kind of weird. I want to talk about some of the fundamental ideas that he's trying to kind of get across with T. Packages will be immutable, so that we won't have any more incidents like left pad. Packages will be available all the time via decentralized storage on a decentralized network. That means if GitHub or NPM went down in the past, we might not have been able to download something, right? But protocols, they don't go down, or at least the idea of protocols don't go down. Ethereum has been running for 10 or so years or something like that. I think there's been one incident of it actually going down. So this idea of protocols, they just don't go down. IPFS is always up. Releases will be signed by the maintainers themselves as opposed to a middleman like a registry or something like that. Tools can be built to fundamentally verify the integrity of your app's open source constitution, because everything is verifiable, it's open and public and on-chain. And then you have a native utility token that powers the network. And that's where things get a little bit interesting, and this is kind of where this idea of Web3 and digital scarcity comes into play. So what does that mean, native utility token? Well, it comes down to this idea of token flow. Now, this is really where it goes into a little bit more depth. So let's read through this real quick, because this is a very long sentence, but it kind of hopefully clarifies what he means that he wants to do with T. So token flowing is where things get really interesting, but first let's set things straight. We're not changing the nature of open source. It's still free. A lot of times when people talk about Web3, they think that it's actually going to be more expensive, when in reality, it's all about making things free, open, accessible, and for anyone to use. Web3 has enabled novel new ways to distribute value, and with our system, people who care about the health of the open source ecosystem buy some token and stake it. Periodically, we reward this staking because it's securing our network. We give a portion of the rewards to the staker and a portion of the rewards to the maintainer and the creator of the packages, and all the dependencies for those packages. So if you build an open source project and you have 10 NBM dependencies, imagine if something was programmatically built into a protocol to when anyone used it, you would get paid, and all the people that you depended on would get paid, and this would all be automated. That's interesting. What are some other protocols that exist that allow people to get funded already through Web3? Well, Gitcoin is a great example of that. Gitcoin is their phrase is get paid to work on open source. So with Gitcoin, you can go and look at all of these different projects that have all of the money that they're essentially giving for grants, or you can actually request money to build something, and it's kind of a platform for people to go to get paid to work on open source. And most of the projects there are Web3 projects. Radical is a decentralized package manager that, it's like a decentralized, I would say, Git protocol. So when we think of Git is a protocol in and of itself, but most of us use a centralized hosted version of that called GitHub or Bitbucket or something like that. So Radical is a decentralized platform for Git hosting. So not only can you just use it to replace GitHub, but they've actually built in a few interesting funding models themselves. So one of them is Radical Drips. Radical Drips is a protocol, and it allows you to basically earn money, or I would say distribute money to different projects that you would like to pay, or you would like to get paid for. without a centralized intermediary. So there's no fees that get charged and go to like a company like GitHub. Unlike the existing way that we do with GitHub. And then also, though, you can actually issue tokens to give memberships to your community. So there's like a way to actually issue some type of ERC20 or ERC721 tokens that would be cryptocurrency or NFTs. Another protocol that is the one that I'm very, very involved with is the Graph protocol. So how does a protocol like the Graph work? Well, we also have a native utility token. And our native utility token allows the network to exist. So what we have is a network of people running software infrastructure called indexers. And if I want to deploy an API to the network, I can do that, and I can earn a portion of the actual fees that get paid in. And we have tokenomics that are built in. So if you want to actually run an indexer, you stake some tokens, and then you earn rewards in exchange for those. And then we have a lot of different things that are going on that kind of make this all work together. So what does that mean, though? So what are these tokens, and how does this idea of tokenization work? Well, let's kind of like flip the idea as opposed to like running a protocol. Let's talk about how people are actually using tokenization in general to kind of get paid for their open source. And let's look at an example that's already worked and other examples that are out there that are similar. So there's this open source developer named Takuo Shunsuke. And he is a Japanese developer that relies on a lot of CSS and JavaScript frameworks for his day-to-day job. And he wanted to kind of create a project that would give money back to all of the people that have helped him in his career because he was using a lot of open source and none of them were getting paid. So he created a project called Generative Masks. And this was basically, I think it was like 400 lines of JavaScript using a library called p5.js. And anyone that minted one of these NFTs basically was contributing like 0.05 ETH to the treasury for this project, and in return they were receiving this dynamic NFT. So he was able to raise $3 million within about 15 minutes of launching this project. 100% of that money went to the open source projects that he relied on in his career, and he kept none of it. Yeah. So he donated all of the $3 million to the Processing Foundation, Processing Community Japan, Open Processing, Coolers. I don't really know all those, but like those are different projects and communities that he benefited from. And not only that, but the great thing about a smart contract is you can program in commission. So whenever someone was then selling or moving that NFT around, they would now get generated more revenue. So over the course of the few weeks after he launched the project, he got another $700,000. And anytime someone buys and sells one of these NFTs, they get return on investment. So why would someone not just say, like, why do we even need the NFT? Let's just ask someone for donations. Well, guess what? We had a very successful project, and this happens all the time. Have you ever heard of someone just like giving $3 million to like, just for the hell of it? No. But when you bring in this idea of some type of ownership, some type of stake, some type of like way to kind of like incentivize them, you're kind of bringing a new incentive mechanism that we haven't really seen. And not only does the value accrue to them, but the person that donated the money also holds value. The person that bought one of those NFTs, the price actually went up double, I believe. So if you were able to contribute to that community, you also had some return on your investment. So it's kind of like a win-win situation. So we're taking away this idea of just a single winner, and we're kind of bringing in like a more of a, I would say, win-win situation. So the last thing, and we're almost done here on time, is this idea of open and public backends. So one of the things that I really used to enjoy using was the Twitter API. And the Twitter API was really, really good at some point. And you could literally build like a multi-million-dollar business on top of their API. But what actually happens in quote-unquote the Web2 space is that if a company that's making money off of their API sees you making more money off of their API, they're going to shut you down. And there's nothing you can do about it. So if you built a big company on top of someone else's API, they're just going to decide one day to just basically shut that off, and you're going to be out of luck. So therefore, you often find it very hard to build a company on top of someone else's API. So it's kind of one of those things that if you do, you can't really sleep well at night because you never know what's going to change. You never know when someone's going to kind of like pull the rug out from under you. But with these decentralized protocols, we know that the data is always going to be there. We know that the smart contract is immutable. We know that code is always going to be there. So we can build a business on top of that. And we see people doing that all the time. So we can now take advantage of someone else's this back end, and we can build out our own front ends on top of that. And you now see apps competing on front ends with existing back ends. So what we're now talking about is this idea of live open source infrastructure. So not only is the code open source, but now we have open source infrastructure and we have open source data, meaning that data is always going to be there as well, so we can also build our applications there. And essentially what this comes down to is this idea of like Web3 APIs. So traditional APIs are centralized, mutable, brittle. The API fluctuates over time, and anyone can close that API at any time. But with Web3, we have distributed and robust infrastructure, meaning these protocols are forever. They live forever. You create something and you can actually use it forever as long as the protocol is still running, as long as the network is still up. You have open composable backends, free to consume, open by nature, trustless, meaning that anyone can interact with them and anyone can write or read to them, and then they're also immutable. So an example of people leveraging this today is DeFi protocols. Uniswap, SushiSwap, Maker, Curve, all of these do over $100 billion worth of transactions flow per year, a lot more than that actually. But the cool part about this is that not only can they build out their own front ends on top of it, I can actually use them and build out my own applications. So you now have the ability to build on top of other people's code, something that we didn't really have before. NFTs is an obvious use case. Because like all you're dealing with is a smart contract, so anyone can build a new front end on top of that. Zora is a good example of this. It's a modular NFT marketplace protocol that will survive as long as the underlying blockchain. This is what Zora looks like, but essentially what it allows you to do is like anyone can build out their own application on top of their protocol. This idea of composability now comes into play because we can now string together multiple protocols to build out new, interesting front ends on top of these protocols that we didn't have before. You have this idea of open and immutable data because we don't have to worry about that API going down. We don't have to worry about that API changing. We know that that data is going to be there. We can be reliant and go to sleep at night knowing we can build out our front ends on top of this. And we're literally getting to the very end. I'm way over on time. So communities and DAOs. One of the DAOs that I'm very involved with is the one that I created called Developer DAO. We have a few people from Developer DAO in here, I think. Yeah, so the Developer DAO is interesting because we enable a community of people to share ownership of a community that in the past would be going to some like large corporation. So if you spend 10 hours a month contributing to the Amazon Discord server answering questions, guess what? You've just given them free tech support and they've given you nothing in return. If you join a DAO, you are, for the most part, given some type of ownership, or you're given the opportunity to earn some type of ownership. And if you build that community up and you build out the things that they're building, create value, and you decide to exit at some point, that stake that you have can be sold on the liquid market. So then you can actually get some of your investment back. But Developer DAO in particular is building out a lot of open source. We've done free events. We actually fly people all over the world to attend events. Like next week, we're flying out about a dozen people or so to go to Dubai. And that money is coming from different protocols that are essentially like giving us that money to sponsor the people that are going. So that's really cool. So a few different DAOs are Developer DAO, the Graph Advocates, MakerDAO, Seed Club, and Super Team. So to wrap this up, what does Web3 mean for open source? Well, to me, it just kind of means more. It means more funding, more collaboration, more opportunities, more free and open code. And again, I don't think that Web3 is a replacement for anything that we had before. Instead, I see it as an enhancement. If you've been a developer for the last 5 years and you are making a lot of money, doing great stuff, and you don't want to learn this stuff, that's great. But if you do learn this, you're still going to make all of the money you made before, but you're going to have more opportunities to make more money. You're going to have more ideas in your head that you can actually build out. I believe the future of finance is going to be built on smart contracts. And so if you want to kind of get ahead of the curve, then definitely check it out. So that's it. Thank you for coming to my talk.